MagMongoSlade. MagMongoSlade.
Welcome to 3 Count Commentaries. This is your host, MagMongoSlade. Today, we're going to talk about the British Bulldog and his A&E biography, which was actually very good. It was one of the better biographies. Had a lot of fun with it. Really good stuff in terms of showing the home videos of his wedding and things like that. Unfortunately, we also got to see home videos of him and Diana having issues. And that's kind of one of the things I want to spend this episode talking about, because as usual, I did a little bit of extra reading. I dug into the stories a little bit more. And a lot of people don't realize that Diana Smith, the sister of Bret the Hitman Hart and Owen Hart, wrote a book called Under the Mat, in which she detailed her relationship with Davey. And she claimed that he raped her nightly. Oh yeah, we're going to talk about it. Because, of course, WWE wasn't going to discuss it. And Diana was in the documentary. But we also need to put that into some really deep context. There was also a book called Pain and Passion that was written on the Hart family and the history of Stampede Wrestling that features a lot of stories about Davey Boy Smith, too. So, let's get into this. The biography was very good. They tell the story about Davey Boy Smith, who looked up to the Dynamite Kid. He was 4 years younger than Dynamite, and Dynamite basically is the reason why we even got Davey Boy in wrestling. Dynamite started training in Wigan in the Snake Pit. He was 16, 17 years old. He eventually brought Davey along, and Davey was 17 when Dynamite brought him to Calgary, and then that's where we get, Davey Boy Smith as the wrestler. He was initially brought in, this is from Pain and Passion, he was actually initially brought in to be an opponent for Dynamite Kid. They wanted to have a sort of good Englishman and a bad Englishman. As it was described, they wanted to have like a Cain and Abel kind of gimmick. That's what they wanted. As usual, you see a lot of these stories feature Dynamite doing terrible things to people, putting X-Lax in people's drinks, and Davey is right there with them. And that becomes the story as they go through the history of the British Bulldogs tag team Dynamite. Because of his style, his body starts to break down very, very quickly. So we're going to start with the breakup of the British Bulldogs, because it's not really detailed in the biography. In the biography, you get the story that there was some jealousy between Davey and Dynamite. I believe this is also one of the things that comes up in Diana's book, also comes up in the biography, and it also comes up in Pain and Passion, is that Dynamite, as his body started to break down, he started having issues with Davey. So in the 80s, the Bulldogs were working in Japan. At this point in time, both Stampede and the WWF had partnerships with New Japan Pro Wrestling. But Dynamite Kid figured, hey, we can make more money at All Japan. He was able to drag Davey into going with All Japan, which of course damaged the New Japan relationship with the WWF and with Stampede Wrestling, pissed everybody off, and people were very upset about this. So Dynamite has been the guy making the decisions for a really long time. And then in the early 90s, Dynamite's body starts to fall apart. And the WWF, when they finally were able to get the Bulldogs back, they start kind of pushing Davey up front. As it's mentioned in Pain and Passion, Davey was the guy scoring the pins. He would be the guy that if the Bulldogs won, they won because of Davey. Davey was the guy who, because he was always smiling and always good-natured, he was the guy with the dog all the time, Matilda. He was the one that they pushed front and center as being the star of the team. And Dynamite had a problem with that, because he felt like he was better than Davey, and he felt like Davey wasn't shit without him. This was something that was, of course, mentioned in the biography too, is that Dynamite didn't believe that Davey could have a career without him. And so that became the schism, is that Dynamite's body starts to fall apart. Davey's career starts to creep up. Now it seems like Dynamite is riding Davey's coattail. And, you know, everybody's treating Davey like he's the star. And Dynamite's like, no, 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 it's all me. He wouldn't even have a career if it wasn't for me. He's an ungrateful punk and all this kind of stuff. This comes from Pain and Passion, which is quoting the Dynamite Kid's book before he passed away. So because Dynamite had always had control over Davey, he decided in 1990 that they were going to leave the WWF. He made that decision. Davey decided not to go because he wanted to continue working with Brett, with Owen, and his new family. You know, even though Dynamite Kid is literally his blood cousin, he's married into the Hart family. He knows all of these people. Vince is treating him appropriately. He's being paid very well. He doesn't want to follow Dynamite anymore. Now, to a degree, it's mentioned that Diana was the problem. In the book, well, one of the books, I think it was Pain and Passion, Dynamite blamed Diana for being the person who constantly bigged up Davey's ego, made him believe that he was a bigger star than he really was, made him believe that he could have a career without him, all this kind of stuff. So when Bulldog Davey decided that he's not going to follow Dynamite to Japan, and he's going to stay in the WWF, and then took ownership of the British Bulldog name, which became a really big problem. Dynamite hated Davey, hated the Harts, didn't want anything to do with them, pretty much for the rest of his life. But Dynamite is a very angry guy, you know, a very bitter guy. And he never really got over the fact that Davey didn't follow him to Japan. Now, because Davey became the British Bulldog, Dynamite couldn't use the name because now it was trademarked by the WWF, and eventually Vince and Davey would have issues about who really owned the name. Ended up being Davey, for the record. But I think Vince owns it. Well, the WWF owns it now, I think. I'm not sure. But in any event, Davey took the name. Dynamite was pissed. And one of the final times that these two had seen each other was when Dynamite, a crippled, beat up Dynamite, decided he was going to try to jump Davey in the locker room in 1994. Now, at this point, Dynamite doesn't work in the WWF and hasn't worked there in years. But the show was in England. Dynamite had his falling out with his family already. He's now living in England. The British Bulldog is, you know, a huge superstar. This is 2 years after the Intercontinental Championship match at Wembley. He's still a huge draw in Europe. Dynamite wants to kill him. So he decides he's going to go backstage and start a fight with Davey at this show, only to get escorted away. And the two of them, to my knowledge, never had a conversation and never saw each other again. According to Diana's book, Vince took the name British Bulldog away from Davey when he left to go to WCW. I'm not sure how that is. I don't remember the first run for Davey in WCW, so I don't remember if he used the British Bulldog name. But he certainly used the colors because they were the British colors, clearly. I don't remember if he used the name British Bulldog. I'm not sure. I don't remember. But apparently, Diana had an issue with Vince continuing to sell tapes and different things like that. And maybe Davey was not getting paid for that. And that became a schism between Vince and Davey. But they ended up clearing it up, of course, as Davey returned. But Davey got fired in the early 90s because he got busted for steroids. And this, of course, was during the steroid drama. So Vince was trying to get everybody who was on the roids away from him. He got rid of the Ultimate Warrior. Hogan seemingly lost a whole person in weight. And Davey Boy Smith was fired. He was exiled to WCW for a short time before he was ended up brought back. Now, the steroids was also blamed on Dynamite Kid, who introduced Davey to steroids. Now, this is pretty consistent with all the information that I have. Is that when Davey came to Calgary, he was muscular but slim, naturally bigger than Dynamite. And then it was Dynamite that actually introduced him into taking steroids. And then Dynamite will also do like really cruel tricks. Like one time he injected him with milk because Davey wasn't injecting himself with steroids. He was trusting Tom Billington, the Dynamite Kid, to do it. And Tom was just injecting weird things into Davey's body. And eventually he really started actually doing steroids. But that just goes to show how vindictive and cruel, you know, the Dynamite Kid was, that his cousin was trusting him to inject him with a substance and he was, you know, using other things. And for starters, putting him on steroids in the first place was a big mistake. But the relationship between Davey and Dynamite can be just that, the stories of them two guys spiking people's drinks and shaving their heads. There's tons of stories like that. Them, spiking guys with X-Lax and watching them crap themselves, them brutally beating people up. It's just a lot of, and a lot of this was Billington. He was the instigator. He would start it and then bring Davey into it. But of course, everybody's responsible for their own behavior on this channel. So it wasn't like Davey was not responsible. It was just that he looked up to Dynamite. And because he looked up to Dynamite, he would do whatever Dynamite wanted him to do. And then once he started having other people that he trusted, one of whom was Brett, another was Diana, because he married Diana, and Brett was another positive influence on Davey. He was able to pull away from Dynamite. So that made it a lot easier when he was time for him to leave the Bulldogs tag team. It was easy because he had Brett and he had Diana pulling him in one way, while it was just bitter old Tom Billington. Even though that's his cousin, even though that he loves him, even though he looked up to him, he realizes that Dynamite hates him, and this cannot go on forever. Now, in the documentary, they talked about Davey Boy Smith being the greatest European wrestler of all time, or the greatest British wrestler, or something to that effect. And I don't want to go into the Wembley match with Brett because it's been talked about so much. I love how the biography shaped it, though, because you saw that Nigel McGuinness, who was working in WWE at the time, so he was a part of this, he was there in the building. So his recollections of what occurred was amazing. It was just fun to know that there's people who got into the business and were inspired by something like that. Now let's talk about Diana's book, which discussed the 1990s, the early 90s WCW run, where she had a big problem with Davey and WCW. And in the book, she calls Vader, quote, clumsy and unskilled. Didn't like that Davey had to do jobs to him. Didn't like the position that he was in WCW. And really was pushing for him to return to the WWF. Now, of course, by this point in time, he had gotten fired for steroid use. He had also gotten arrested for being in a bar fight. So apparently there was some kid who got into a fight with the British Bulldog. I think the kid's name was Cody Light, if I remember correctly. The kid disrespected Diana in the bar, said something vulgar towards her, and led to Davey Boy. Some people say spiking the guy on his head, like lifting him up and spiking him. Other people have said that, he grabbed him in a headlock and the kid slipped and then he hit his head on the ground. I say kid, he was 20. And that's what caused his injuries. She denied that it occurred the way that the media said that it occurred, that he had gotten a power driver or a body slam or something like that. But the interesting bit about this that I found to be very entertaining is in the book, they discussed how Davey Boy defended himself in court. That he went to court and said, yeah, wrestling's a work. I can't do all that stuff for real. All these guys help me. And it ended up working because nobody believes that wrestling is real. So nobody believed that he literally might have picked this kid up and spiked him on his head. The fact that wrestling was a work worked and got him off, which was incredibly entertaining to me. But Bulldog was known for getting into fights. He had gotten into a couple of bar fights. He got into a bar fight in 1983 where, he got into these guys were throwing bottles at the Stampede bus. Bulldog and Dynamite jumped off the bus and went and headbutted some guys and got into all kinds of trouble. Bulldog was a guy who got arrested a lot, and I'm pretty sure a lot of it had to do with steroid use. So he also got arrested for threatening to kill Diana, which is something, of course, didn't talk about at all, is that he threatened to kill Diana and Ellie Hart. Ellie Hart is the mother of Natalia. Now, this happened after his career pretty much winded down, and shortly before his death, actually, in 2000, is when he was arrested for threatening to kill Diana. Now, I couldn't find any good reason why he would want to kill Elizabeth or Ellie Hart, but Diana had decided to divorce him. Now, Diana had divorced him because he was a drug addict and because his behavior was out of control. But they had been having issues for a really long time. This is where we kind of go into Diana's book. Now, to contextualize this book a little bit, Diana was getting divorced, and the Harts were in the middle of the lawsuit. Brett wasn't speaking to anybody. Martha wasn't speaking to anybody. Diana had a problem. Everybody was at odds with each other. So she writes this under the mat. It's a tell-all book where she's actually going to obliterate everybody. And in the book are some things that are somewhat consistent with other things that I've seen. And then there are things that are the wildest possible things. One of which is that Davy Boy Smith would only have sex with her if she was unconscious. And she says that pretty much every night he would spike her orange juice so that she would fall asleep and he could rape her. She said that she could not keep up with his sexual appetite, and he certainly did not want to have sex with her if she was conscious. There was a lot of stuff in that book that was absolutely insane. So I was not surprised to see Diana in this episode talking so glowingly about Davy, but it was jarring knowing that I had read that stuff. And now she's here talking about how great he was and everything. And, you know, the love story between Diana and Davy is pretty interesting, though. That Diana pretty much fell in love with him immediately. As soon as he came over and started living near the Hart house, she was obsessed with him. And then eventually, you know, they got married and all this kind of stuff. But she had held a bitterness within her for years. Part of which because 3 weeks before they got married, Davy Boy came to her and told her he had been having an affair. And that the woman he had been having an affair with had gotten pregnant. So that becomes a really big deal. In the book, Pain and Passion, it was noted that this was a ring rat from Edmonton that a lot of the boys had slept with. So they never really found out whether that child was Davy's child or not. But apparently Diana held some bitterness about that. She married him anyway. Again, this was 3 weeks before the wedding. She married him anyway. She had children with him anyway. But she kept that bottled up for years. Also, if that wasn't enough of a slap in the face, once they started having their issues, Diana and Davy, Davy ended up sleeping with Bruce's wife. Now, Bruce Hart, of course, is the brother of Brett, brother of Diana. He was the guy who was running Stampede Wrestling for Stu. He's also the guy who, no matter what Jim Cornette and all these people tell you, he was the guy who was running Stampede Wrestling behind Vince McMahon's back that led to Vince not paying Stu Hart the rest of the money that he owed him. It was because of Bruce. Anyway, Bruce had a wife named Andrea, and Andrea decided she was going to run off with Davy Boy Smith, left her 5 children, and ran off with this guy. In fact, they were still together when Davy Boy died. She was with him the night he died. It is an absolutely, this became so ugly that when Davy died, they had 2 funerals, one for Andrea and another one for the rest of the family. Andrea was in the media telling people that her and Davy were going to get married. It was crazy. And they tell the story that this made the Harts, for the first time, look like white trash. Because you got this guy who dumps Diana and runs off with her sister-in-law. And they're playing in each other's face in public and all these things. And when Diana starts to date other people, Davy gets mad and he's upset that they're being divorced. And now he's going to kill her. And somehow Ellie gets involved with this. He's going to kill her too. And then he gets arrested for that. He gets out of jail. He threatens them again, gets arrested again for that. And of course, they let him out again. And he ended up dying about maybe a year or 2 afterwards. So if you ever find a copy of Diana's book, it's completely out of print. She got sued by Martha, and the book had got pulled from the shelves. because a lot of the stuff she had said about Martha in the book was kind of slanderous. One of the things she said about is that Martha was very controlling of Owen. This is something that has also been said by Brett to a degree, that Martha controlled Owen. And she, and speaking for a lot of members of the family, said that they recognized that what happened to Owen was an accident. And they seemingly didn't like Martha anyway. So when Martha started kind of disrespecting the parents during the lawsuit, that whole thing got ugly. And then she wrote in this book that Owen was having an affair with some other woman, and he wanted to leave Martha for this other woman. But he felt like he had to stay with Martha because Martha would hurt herself if she didn't stay. It was really terrible. And for this reason, Martha sued her, and the book got pulled from the shelves. Rightfully so. It is absolutely slanderous. She also claimed that Brett threatened to kill her because she talked Davey Boy into going back to the WWF after the Montreal Screwjob. Now, I don't want to talk about the Montreal Screwjob either because it's been beaten to death. But Bulldog quit the WWF afterwards. Everybody knows this. He got fined $100,000 for that, but he quit. He didn't really want to leave, but he felt like he had to leave because he wanted to support Brett, and he had always looked up to Brett, and Brett in their mind, did nothing wrong during this instance. But the family, Diana, was kind of like, Brett's got a big ego. He should have just did what Vince told him to do. You know, she's willing to capitulate. She's kind of like, that's just Brett being Brett with his huge ego. And when the Owen Hart thing happened, she says, oh, it was just an accident. You know, we all understand it was just an accident. You know, Owen was like a son to Vince. And then apparently that's what set Brett off, and he called and threatened to burn her house down and all this kind of crazy stuff. But when I read an article about, Davey being arrested, him dying, Brett separated himself from them, saying he doesn't even speak to them. He doesn't talk to them. He doesn't want anything to do with these people. It was almost as if this was, he's talking about aliens or something. Like he's just so separate from them that he just wanted nothing to do with them. So apparently that's what was going on at the time, is that Diana and Brett were not having a good relationship because, she was going against what they viewed as the family at the time by, talking her husband into going back to the WWF, saying that the Owen Hart thing was an accident and people should just get over it. That just really bristled people. And there was some talk, I think, from Brett's side that, Diana wanted to be in the business, and Vince used her a little bit during 1996. I don't know if you guys remembered it. They didn't talk about it in the biography. They probably should have, since she was there. That, Vince brought her in, put her in Bulldog's corner. She was there for not just the Wembley angle, but also the 1995 angle, which she says Brett was doing drugs with Davey at the time. So she claims that, Davey and Brett were doing drugs before the big match in 95. I don't remember Brett ever mentioning that in his book. So it's probably not true, but that's what she said, okay? So, but the idea is that Brett believes that Diana always wanted to be in the business, and that Vince was offering her an opportunity to be in the business. And that's why she was so loyal to Vince, rather than the family. And it was not something that was mirrored by Martha. Martha has always said that the Harts have been irrationally attached to the WWF, and she never had that attachment because she hated wrestling. She didn't like wrestling. She wanted Owen to be a firefighter, but apparently he didn't pass the physical or something. Something happened where he didn't become a firefighter. But she always hated wrestling in the first place, so she didn't understand why the Harts were so entangled with the WWF. And, Brett was just kind of like everybody's in it for themselves. He thought that, Jim Neidhart was being paid under the table, and that, Davey Boy went back, even though he got humiliated by, getting body slammed on poop and all this kind of stuff. Or no, it was a rock bottom. He had to take on a stack of dog shit. But at this point, Bulldog is physically destroyed. He is not really even a name anymore. He's slowly going backwards in terms of his progression. Of course, they sent him to rehab. He didn't complete this rehab. He left the rehab, and that's why Diana left him in the first place. It's a lot, right? So the late 90s was a really ugly time. The late 90s to the early 2000s, a really ugly time. But it seems that everybody, got together eventually and was making things right. And you see some really cool footage of Bulldog teaming with his son Harry. Harry was 16 in those videos. They didn't tell anybody that, but he was helping Harry get his career started. Bulldog had already pretty much been on the outs. He didn't make it in the WWF anymore. He probably was never going to get back there due to his drug issues and due to, the severe damage to his back that happened from the trap door in WCW. So he probably was never going to go back. So he wanted to help launch his son's career. But in addition to that, he had also taken TJ Wilson under his wing. TJ Wilson, of course, for those of you who don't know, is the husband of Natalya. And he apparently is a runaway to something like that. He has some family issues. And he really liked wrestling. And Davey took him in and was a mentor to him. And he sort of was in the midst of doing that when his heart gave out and he died at age 39. So if you watch the biography, it was fantastic. It was actually very good. There was a lot of dark stuff that they didn't get into. If they had done the British Bulldog, I think in season 1, they probably would have brought out a lot of the more of the dark stuff. You could see the hard pivot in the WWE biographies from season 1 to the to the rest of the seasons, where they kind of smooth over anything that doesn't involve just basic drugs and alcohol. And then they just say, oh, the demons got him. The demons got him. But they don't really go into detail to what the demons really pushed them to do or what kind of personality a lot of these people had. But by all rights, they were, from everything I've read, Davey Boy was the complete opposite of Dynamite Kid. He was cheerful. He was loving. He was warm. He was, he was a troublemaker only when somebody else had instigated it and they kind of dragged him into it. He was very gullible and naive in that way. But other than that, when the drugs got him, that led to a lot of his negative behaviors too. But I think that they covered a lot of ground. They did a good job. They focused on the high points, which of course was Wembley. I think there were other things that the British Bulldog had done that maybe they should have talked about. Diana mentioned that when Davey re-signed with the WWF, they pitched the European title as a way to get him to stay, because they wanted him to be featured on the show, but he couldn't be the world champion. So they was going to create the European title and build around him. And then they told the story about him losing it to Shawn. And then Brett got in his ear that they're trying to embarrass you. They're trying to humiliate you. Why you got to lose in your hometown, blah, 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 blah. And then Bulldog went and did the job. And then Brett started, giving him some shit about it. Even though the plan was for Bulldog to win it back. He never won it back. But, there's a lot of little stories like that would have been fun and interesting to spice the story up a little bit. And I think that biography should be somewhat spicy. I don't know if they should be bland, vanilla. Oh, this guy was great, but he also did drugs. And, it was the drugs that led to him dying or whatever. Like, yeah, that's nice. But let's get into a little bit of detail. I know you only got like an hour, but those things I feel like are kind of important. But a lot of this stuff is, with Diana talking about, he raped her and all this sort of stuff. We don't know if that stuff's true. And let's be honest, she was probably just very angry about it, the divorce, and it was very bitter. And she just wrote crazy stuff. But it was by far the most jarring thing because it seems very out of character. But then again, I don't know these people. But did you guys enjoy the biography? Let me know in the comment section below. Like, share, subscribe. I will talk to you guys later, man. Peace.
Tell me what's worse than learning all that you led to believe was all horse crap. They distort, so question